live up to the billing and then worth the price of admission. I guess you didn't pay much, right? Okay. But lower the expectations right off the bat. I do work at UK. I'm in the Agricultural Economics Department at UK. I've been there forever and ever, long enough. I teach a couple of classes. I teach an ag management course, which met today. We talked about capital investing and things like that. I have been at the University of Kentucky long enough, but I have grand students. Yes, that has made me feel old when I have students that their parents were students of mine back usually in the 90s. So I've been at UK actually since 92. I am a native of northeastern Tennessee, as far up in the tip end of Tennessee as you can go, tucked in between Virginia and North Carolina. And if you haven't figured it out by when I open my mouth, that makes me purebred hillbilly. So I grew up on a little farm there that my dad said, he used to tell everybody I took home with him. He said, the Lord felt sorry for us and pulled the ground up in the middle so we could farm both sides. And so I grew up on a hillside farm with tobacco and cattle, and square hay bales would not lay on the ground. My first job was following a hay baler to make sure the bales didn't roll into the lake or into the tobacco patch. In fact, this notion of farm preservation, try not to buy property anywhere near my family. In the 1940s, both sides of my family, my mom's family, my dad's family, were both relocated by TVA Lake. Came in, just bought everything out, lock, stock, and barrel, moved everybody out of the creek and river bottoms and up on the ridges. They filled that lake like 6 years before I was born, so I had no memory. Everything that my parents and grandparents talked about were things that I never got to see, because it was under 125 feet of TVA Lake. In 1984, I guess, they dropped the water down to check some things at the dam, and I was able to walk the streets of the town of Butler, Tennessee, where my mother had grown up. My grandfather ran a service station there, so I at least got to put things in some sort of a location. That was really interesting. But like at that time, the water had been in the dam or in the lake for 35 years. And now this was interesting. I didn't know this plan. When we went to my house, my mom grew up in, of course, they tore all the houses down and moved them and moved everything out. But that was about 125 feet of water, and there's not much dissolved oxygen at that level. So the shrubs were still in the backyard. I mean, there were twigs the size of your finger that had not rotted because there was not enough oxygen. And one of my favorite memories is my mom, there was an old apple tree that was standing there, and she said, yeah, that's the tree that I fell out of, hit my chin, blood going everywhere. She ran in, my grandmother said, I broke my tongue. So I got to see the tree eventually. So among us hillbilly, storytelling is just part of our lifeblood. So if I get off on stories, you might sort of get me back on track, but I try to make the stories make some sense to what we're teaching. I teach economics, which has to be the dumbest thing ever invented by humankind. And I try to teach economics with stories in ways that students can understand. So if I can convince somebody that, if I can teach marginal economic principles by talking about Wayne Woods Hogs, I'm going to do it. So that's a bit about where I have been, where I come from. This notion of farm succession has been probably the predominant part of my extension program out in the state. University pays me to teach classes on campus and also come out in the state. I've got an extension teaching split, a little heavier teaching than most folks. I teach the ag management course I mentioned, and then tomorrow night, this time, I will be in a human resource management course at UK. So, and I love students. I really enjoy it. That's one of the favorite parts of my job. This picture, which recurs back through this is my son when he was about 6 years old, and that's out in western Kentucky. And that was part of the culmination of a goal. I try to teach goal setting to my students. I set a goal when I graduated from college that I was going to take the month of October off sometime. That's a kind of weird goal, isn't it? Just take the whole month off. Can't do that when you're working, paying somebody else. Can't do it when you're teaching. But the reason I like to want to take the month of October off is growing up where I did in the southern Appalachian Mountains. October is wonderful. Sky's blue, the leaves are turning, the tourists all go to Gatlinburg. But the part of where I was, I wanted to be tourists, and I just wanted to be able to enjoy the month of October. In October 2003, I had been teaching courses fall semester. I switched off with somebody and started teaching spring semester. So that freed up my teaching schedule in the fall. My son and my wife and I loaded up in the car. We followed Lewis and Clark to the M High Pass on the Montana-Idaho border. And when I tell this story, when I'm trying to teach my students about goal setting, because that is something we would never have done, I would never have done, had it not been a goal that I set when I graduated from college. It took 27 years to reach that goal. But that remains one of my favorite memories of all time, was traveling with them for that month of October. Now, there is a real paradox, I think, in agriculture, because we are really keen on heritage. We love it. I managed, the county I grew up in, I went back up there after an undergraduate degree, and I managed a farm for about 9 years that they were big on heritage because they had in the safe, in the farm office, a land grant from King George III. They had that, I mean, it'd been there forever. They were in the 8th generation, so they, you know, and we're all like that. I mean, we like to talk about 5th generation farming or 4th generation farming and you know, generations farming together. So we're really keen on that. If we're so keen on that, why do we not do a better job of it? That's a perplexing thing to me. If we did a better job, there wouldn't be any need for me to come out here and talk to folks about trying to do this. It's a real paradox that I do not have a good explanation for. Because it looks like if we're this much interested in it, then we would do a better job. Some things that you may have heard, and I know that Clint Quarles has been here, and David Marison has been here. I've worked with both of them for probably the last 10 years or longer. Clint, in fact, was an undergraduate in one of my courses many years ago. And so we're probably going to overlap on some things. I think that's okay. So you may have seen some statistics like this. About 2/3 of Americans don't even have a will. That's not just agriculture, that's everybody. And Farm Journal did an article a few years ago that found that only about 20%, 1 in 5 farms, had a good succession plan or had confidence in their succession plan. Everybody planned on, pretty much everybody planned on passing it on, but they really didn't think they had a good plan in place. And I know David talked a good bit about families and family communication and dysfunctional families. I have seen his presentation. Did he use the little video with the nail?
No.
He didn't? Darn. Well, I don't have that. Now he doesn't mention it because y'all going to wonder what that is, aren't you? I don't have it here. Go home and on YouTube, search for It's Not the Nail. And it's like a 2-minute video. It has a really good story about how we communicate with each other. So I don't have that. I thought David would use that, so my apologies for bringing up something that I can't show you. Go home and check it out. But almost everybody plans on transferring land or something to the next generation. Is that, let's talk about it. Is that why you're here? You're planning on transferring land or something to other folks, to the next generation? Are you? Nod heads, shake heads, no? You have kids that you want, okay? If you're not, why in the heck are you here? No. Transferring land?
Probably at some point.
A farm business at some point?
Maybe.
Maybe? Okay. Okay.
At some point.
You hope so? You look like you might be, you might be the recipient, right? Okay. So, tell me about your farm.
It's 40 acres.
And you got somebody you'd like to transfer it to?
Our daughter?
Okay. Okay. Is she aware of that?
Yes.
Okay, good. I want to come back to that point. You're hoping to get some farmland somewhere?
I work with the conservation.
Oh, okay.
I don't have any farmland.
Okay. Would you like some? Somebody here might touch you up. You guys?
Just acquired on 30 acres.
Oh, okay. But at some point down the road, that's going to transition to somebody else. What? You're nodding your head? Okay. Okay, definitely. Okay. Generally, if we have land, that's one of the things usually we're considering doing that, particularly if we have kids. We'd like for that to pass on. The farm that I grew up on, my dad sold it 30 years ago. I was fine with that. My grandparents had it, my great-grandparents had it, but I mentioned the lake, it became lakefront property. Now that's like northern Kentucky property, right? It gets really valuable in a hurry. And Dad found somebody, and he was like 60 when he sold it. So, and I was fine with that because I was not going to go back there and farm that. I had moved away. It wasn't the kind of farm I could make a living on anyway. And Dad sold that early enough to be able to reap some of the benefits of his hard work. He was healthy. He was able to travel some and do some things. He is still alive at 93. And we still have good conversations. His mobility is limited, but his mind is good and clear, and we talk fairly frequently. So I think most of the time we do want to transfer that. Businesses, non-farm businesses, have some difficulty. When you study, business startups, first generation does a good job. Second generation, third generation, oftentimes it falls apart. So first to second generation, about 30% success. Second to third, about 10%. And third to fourth generation, it gets really, really slim. You notice the pictures have become blurrier and blurrier. That statement at the bottom, on the surface, sounds well-intentioned. Say, don't worry, I'll take care of it. I have, unfortunately, seen that too many times be translated as, I don't want to talk about this. It's an uncomfortable topic. I've got some slides here later on about how to start the discussion. Is this the kind of discussion you want to have with your families? Okay, let me put it this way. Is this the type of discussion you need to have with your families? Is it the discussion you want to have with your families? Why is it that the most important discussion we need to have is the one that's hardest to start? Now, I have a few tips maybe here later on, but I have a story of how not to start this. This is not the way to do it. Husband and wife sitting on the sofa one night, getting along up in years. Wife looks over to husband and says, honey, said, if I die and you remarry, would you let her drive my car? He says, what? He says, well, if I die and you remarry, would you let your new wife drive my car? He said, well, what kind of a question is that? I don't know. I never thought about that. This is not the kind of thing I want to talk about. But I guess, if she didn't have a car and your car's still here, why not? So it goes on a few minutes. She says, honey, said, if I die before you and you remarry, would you let her live in my house? Oh, man, what kind of a question is that? Why are you asking me this? But I don't know. We've got the house. I guess, I don't know. Goes on a few minutes. She looks over and says, honey, said, if I die and you remarry, will you let her wear my clothes? He says, well, no, your clothes won't fit her. So don't put that on the list. Don't start it that way. Credit, anybody heard, Louis Grizzard used to tell that story. Anybody remember Louis Grizzard, the comedian? So, but don't worry, I'll take care of you. I fear is this thing that has stopped a lot of conversations. Now, this is a woodcut. Anybody want to hazard a guess who these people are? I'll just let you know. Who would this be? Who do you think this depicts? Shakers. They're better known as Shakers. It was the United Society of Believers in the Second Coming of Christ's Second Appearing, and they were Shakers. From where I live in the south end of Woodford County, this time of year, with the leaves down, I can see the tops of the buildings at Shaker Village at Pleasant Hill. About 5 miles away as the crow flies. It takes about half an hour to wind around the roads to get there. But a neat place. And they were interesting people. I've enjoyed doing this. They had a lousy succession plan. Terrible. Have you ever met a Shaker? No. Why not?
They died off.
Yeah, why did they die off?
They didn't have any kids.
They didn't have any kids. Yeah, they had a lousy breeding program. And I can say that, this is an agricultural group, you know? No, they were celibate. Now, that was part of their religion. And if you, how many of you have been to Shaker Village, Pleasant Hill? Anybody? Yeah, it is a neat place. If you haven't, make a trip down there. The food's good, they have accommodations there, it's a neat place. But men and women lived separately, they ate separately, they were just separated, and they did not have a succession plan. So now it's sort of a touristy place, but there are no Shakers. So I hope everybody here is thinking better about succession. This is what brings a good number of folks out to sessions like this, and probably all of us have heard that, yeah, farmers are getting older. Granted, everybody's getting older. One of my favorite stories was about a company that the president sent down to the HR department and asked how many of our employees are approaching retirement age, and the memo came back, all of them. Everybody's going in that direction. So this notion, though, and you've heard this one, that farmers are aging, they're an old occupational group, and I checked it out on this. I went back and looked at Ag Census back to 1977, and sure enough, the average age of American farmers has increased about 1 year in each 5-year census cycle since the mid-70s. We're in another census cycle, 2022, the census year, so you probably had those letters in the mail. Everybody get those about filling out the census form. So you've seen those. If that trend holds, then the average age of American farmers will be above 60 years old. So yeah, granted, that's it. Now, that I think is skewed a little high because they've changed it a little bit in the last time or two, but the census folks ask about the average age or the age of the principal operator. So if you've got a multi-generational farm, usually that's the oldest person out there. So I think that skews it a little higher. But now Bureau of Labor Statistics, they look sort of at all farmers in general, and they found that average age in 2018 was 56.4. Now, interestingly enough, that by BLS numbers is the oldest occupational group. Now, here's my test for you. What are the next four? What other groups would be in that old category? Other occupational groups? Give me a guess. If you say professors, I am going to leave right now. I'm old. I agree. Guesses?
Construction?
Construction? Nope. Still a lot of people young. Bankers? Nope.
It's lawyers.
What?
It's lawyers.
No, but that's close. Judges.
Oh, okay.
See, lawyers they keep cranking them out. You know, they have law schools, and they keep cranking these out. So they make more lawyers. But now judges, you have to be at it for a while to become a judge. So yes, farmers, judges. There's 3 more. Give me some guesses.
President.
Yes, but that is not an occupational category. I cannot argue with you, but that's not its own category. Okay, anybody else? Farmers and judges. Physicians, nope. Just like lawyers, have med schools. Keep cranking them out. Yeah.
People in religious life.
Clergy. That's right. Yeah, clergy would be in that category. 2 more. Anybody want to take some guesses?
Machinists?
Nope. Bus drivers.
Large animal veterinarian.
What? Large animal vets, you would think, wouldn't you? Yeah. The 5th one would be tailors. Now, I don't even know if I know a tailor. But if you do, they're probably old. So those are the 5 oldest categories. The youngest, not to be surprised, would be hostesses at restaurants and lifeguards and things like that. So yes, we do have an aging population. I like graphs. So this is a neat graph, I think. I don't know how to get this set up. This is 4 census cycles, and the way this barrel is divided up, each one of these barrels is roughly the 2 million farms that we have in the country. In 2022, this is the category of under 45, the middle is 45 to 64, and the old is over 65. So notice that this younger group has been going down. The oldest group has been getting bigger. As you'd expect, the demographic is the population going up. Now, these are broad categories, under 45 and over 65. If you dig a little deeper, if you look at principal operators under 25, in, I think this was the last census cycle, there was 27 principal operators over 75 for every one that was under 25. Because we don't have very many young farmers, but again, that's the principal operator thing. That doesn't mean there aren't a lot of young farmers out there. They just wouldn't necessarily be identified as the principal operator. This is something I like to do with my students at UK. Not all, but a lot of them would like to go back to the farm. They're in ag. Some of them are going to go in agribusiness or ag finance or any number of things. More than half of my students in my ag management class, what they want to do for the rest of their life is ride a horse. We have an equine management program at UK that is one of the largest majors we have in college. And we attract a lot of people who are there because they like horses. Will they have enough jobs in the equine industry? I don't know, but some of them don't care. They just like horses. They found a major. They're going to do something else. They'll probably have horses the rest of their life. But for the ones who are interested in farming, and I think this is critical because you are the folks that own the land. The younger folks are the ones that are looking for the land. Now, given what I've just said about age, in that 2017 census, we had nearly $50 billion worth of ag assets in Kentucky. Now, I've got another study here in a minute that suggests how much of that will transition. It's about 10% every 5 years. So in a 10-year period, about 20% of farmland will transition from one generation to the next. 20% of 48.8 billion is nearly $1 billion a year, $2.7 million a day, or by last year's ag values, land values, in Kentucky the average is 43.55. We are transferring the equivalent of a 600-acre farm every day. That's a lot of assets. And that's not just in agriculture. I'm not the only baby boomer in here, right? Yeah, born between, 45 and 65. Us boomers are transferring, just outside of ag, just in general, are transferring trillions of dollars of assets. Because the boomer generation has it, it's going to transfer. So when I show this to students, they like this. You know, there's potential out there, there's opportunity out there. But I mentioned a minute ago, conversation everybody's reluctant to have, but every single farm and piece of property will have a transition. It is inevitable, because nobody's lived forever yet, at least stayed on the planet. So it's going to transition, and I bet everything I own, David might not have had the nail thing, but Clint Quarles talked about what happens with property if you don't have a will, right? That the state has a succession plan, a transition plan for everybody. And he is divided up, whether you have a will or not. Spouses, kids, those sorts of things. Now, I don't know if he said this. Sometimes when Clint and I are working together, I don't think he said this. I was on a workshop with an attorney who had the best single sound bite I think I've ever heard in my life on this topic. And it was in reference to this, the state of Kentucky's succession plan that they have in place for people without a will. This attorney got up in front of the Women in Ag Conference in Louisville, and he spoke to those ladies, and he said, if you would like to be a business partner with your husband's ex-wife, let him die without a will. Yeah, there were people making notes to call attorney tomorrow. and that's the way Clint described that. Did he mention that situation? But I mean, it would happen. I mean, if there's kids by two wives, and there's no will in place, and that land transfers to the surviving spouse and the children. So you could conceivably have two ex-wives as business partners, or ex-husbands, I guess, if you want to go that way. But yeah, that's the way to think. So I think that transitioning the assets is really the relatively easy part. Any attorney worth their salt can figure out and help you write a will and transition the assets. The more difficult part is if you want the business or the family or the farm or whatever you have, if you want that to continue in somewhat the format that you've had it, the way you've had it, then that becomes more problematic. So that's where I want to focus some attention this evening. Now, a little bit more on land. This was a survey. We really, a minute ago I was talking about we transfer a lot, but most of it is transitioned within families. This was a survey, total transition of, and ownership of land. There's a little over 900 million acres of land in the country, and about this much of it transfers every 5 years, roughly 10%. Now, the little graphic over here, everything except this is within a family. It's in trust, it's in gifts, it's in wills, or a sale to a relative. So only about a fourth of the land that transitions, the farmland that transitions, is by sale to a non-relative. Now, I mean, we're here about land purchase. Were you aware of that? I don't think I knew that until this. I thought there was considerably more land that was sold. Because we see it, I mean, there's auction stuff out there. But really, land is what we economists would call a thin market. That in any given year, it's not likely that more than about 2% of the land in an area will transition. Or be sold. I'm sorry, it'll transition, but be sold. So that's why sometimes it's difficult to figure out values on land. But at any rate, relatively small portion is sold. Most of it transitioned to families. So I'm convinced that instead of saying, don't worry, I'll take care of you, we ought to be saying, this is how we're going to take care of things. And I'll say this won't be the first time I'll say this. We're going to talk more about starting the conversations. I like audiences where there's gray hairs like mine here, because I think it's the responsibility of the older generation to start the discussion. It is a very difficult conversation for younger generations to start without feeling like they're asking the question, what are you going to leave me? It's almost like if the young folks start it, it's like, well, what am I going to get when you die? So they shouldn't be put in that position. I don't think young people should be. It should be us. It should be the older generation that starts that discussion. Now, I want to hammer this point home, and I've really just started this in the last year or two. And I see this a lot. There needs to be a discussion when you're transitioning, particularly a business or really anything. Is this an opportunity or an obligation? That question has to be asked. And if it's an opportunity, fine. If it's an obligation, it's almost a recipe for disaster, or it's something that somebody's not going to be happy doing. There is a term for what I'm describing, and I didn't know this until just the last year or so. And don't ask me how, because I don't read the American Psychological Association dictionary for fun, but there is a term for this. It's called identity foreclosure. And it's identity foreclosure, and you can look it up, but it is essentially the forcing of an identity on someone without them having a choice. And we do that all the time. How many of you who had farm kids bought them farm toys? I did. I mean, when our son was little, I bought him, he had that John Deere cap on. That's a UK cap he's got on there right now. But I bought him John Deere caps, I bought him Carhartts, we put him coveralls. Now, another thing, I know that Clint sometimes says this, he says, what do you think attorneys get their kids? They give them little legal pads? Did he tell that one? I don't know if he, I've heard him say that. No, we expect our kids to want to be farmers. That's okay. But identity foreclosure is broader than that. Most of our sports allegiances are without giving thought. You're UK fans. I don't have any up here, but you're UK fans because you're raised that way. You weren't given a choice. Dare I say some people are Democrats or Republicans because they were raised that way. Dare I say that some people are Baptist or Methodist because they were raised that way. They really weren't given a choice. It was just that obligation. Now, obligation is not the right word, but it just, as that happened, it happened fairly innocently and generally is accommodated. Those folks are happy to be Methodists or Kentucky fans or Republicans or Democrats or whatever it might be. But when it is imposed without a choice is when it becomes a problem. And it may not even be a forced kind of thing. It may just be the expectation that that's the way it's going to be done. And sometimes that's more insidious than telling somebody, you got to do it this way. If we just sort of cultivate for 30 years that, yes, son, this is all going to be yours when I die. I told my son that in the junkyard that doubles as our basement. I told him here, recent son, so all this is going to be yours sometime. He says, yes, and we're going to have a real big bonfire. Because I don't throw anything away. So this notion that this discussion has to be part of this discussion. Are you, when you transfer property to kids, is that an opportunity? If it is, it's a wonderful opportunity. It is wonderful. But if there's an obligation there, if they feel like, well, I've got to do this because this is what mom and dad expect of me, then we need to have, and this is part of this conversation. We're talking about dividing up assets and how we divide up the farm and all that sort of thing. This one doesn't get discussed as often because we almost assume that that's the case, that the kids are going to want the business. And that needs to be an open discussion. And if the kids, if that's what they want to do, wonderful. If they don't want to do, then fine. This, not just in the succession planning work, but I work in the ag finance world. I told my students today that one of the hardest things in my job over the last 30 years is to be invited to a farm when I was sort of the last straw. They had used up all their credit. They were in debt so deep they're not going to get out. There's just no hope for them. And that sometimes my only role was to recommend a good bankruptcy attorney. And that's a hard discussion to have. And I've sat around tables and done that more than I would care to admit in the last 30 years. That whole notion of identity foreclosure gets tied up in that as well. Because we think if we're farmers, we're a failure if we do anything else. If you're a school teacher and decide to go to law school, you've changed professions. If you're a forest ranger and decide to go back to school and become an attorney, you've just changed professions. But unfortunately, in too many communities and too many families, if you're a farmer and decide to do something else, it's because you failed. An ag nurse that I worked a lot with, she says, we don't do a good job in agriculture of giving people permission to leave. Because we're so wrapped up in this identity as farmers that we can't see a bigger picture. And folks, I am not accusing you. I am as guilty of this as anybody. The first words I taught Ben to say was alfalfa. That's because that's what he was sort of saying anyway. And this is another lesson that I teach my students. I said, do not, under any circumstances, ever teach your child to say John Deere before they can say mama. I have paid for that for years now. I do not do that. So, I mean, I'm as guilty of this, and this is, to me, an overriding question in all of this. If it's an opportunity, it's wonderful. If it's an obligation, we need to have some conversations. Thoughts? Comments? Do you think I'm really off base with this? I'm getting some nodding heads. I mean, I think, and this is a hard thing. We want our kids. I want my son to want that little farm that we have out on the Kentucky River Bluffs, 5 miles from Shaker Village. I think he will, but he recognizes, well, I haven't made a living on it. I made a living as a UK professor. And he's aware that, I don't know if he will wind up there. We only have one son, so our succession transition planning is not going to be difficult. And I would love for him to have it, but I'm going to tell him that when we're gone, if you want to sell this, that's your choice. It's his property. So this is an overriding question, I think. Okay. 4 basic questions. What do you want to transfer? You've talked about some with Clint, I'm sure. Can the business afford it? And I'm an economist, so I have to show you some numbers. They take my degree away. How do you make it happen, and how do we manage death taxes? How many folks signed up for this or started this session worried about death taxes? Anybody worried about the tax situation? Well, good, you may be more well-informed than most folks. We've done these over the years, and half the hands would go up to, yeah, I don't want to pay the taxes. Well, I'm going to handle that problem first, answer that question, the fourth question first, because for all intents and purposes, there aren't any. Now, 30 years ago, that would not have been the case. 30 years ago, you could only exempt about $500,000 of assets in a business, and then the rest of it got taxed at like 55%. Well, that has gone up to the point where, I was going to look this up this afternoon, it's something 11.7 up toward 12 million. Anybody know right off the top of your head? It's about $12 million worth of assets that are exempt from federal estate taxes per spouse. There is what's called transportability. If one spouse doesn't use all that, it gets transferred to the other spouse. So a husband and wife together have somewhere in the neighborhood of $23 to $24 million worth of federal estate tax exemptions before you have to worry at all about estate taxes. Now that got bumped up, and Congress changes this from time to time. Yeah, I believe I'm correct on this. The current values are set to expire, I think, in 2026, unless there's congressional action, and it revert back to a lower level. So if you are still alive in 2026, keep an eye on your kids. Because you don't want to. Now, actually, I think they'll extend it. They did the last time. I don't think this is something that's going to go away. The other point, and we've all seen these commercials. Politicians love these commercials because death taxes, that's about as ominous a sounding thing as you can have, right? It sounds awful. And politicians get up and say, well, I'm going to protect you from death taxes. They really like that. And politicians of all parties are guilty of saying this. But I have been working in ag farm management for 30 years now, worked as a farm manager for years before that. I have never seen a farm destroyed by taxes, by death taxes. If you have, let's talk after the session. Now, like I say, 30 years ago, I knew some farms that had to sell some assets to pay taxes because the exemptions were much lower and the tax rate was really pretty high. So I've seen some damage, but I've never seen taxes destroy a family farm, no matter what a political commercial will tell you. So this is one that I don't think we have to worry about. In fact, if you have more than $24 million worth of assets, I'm up for adoption. I'll help you with that. So really it's the kind of thing that gets a lot of publicity, gets a lot of press, gets a lot of airtime, but death taxes are not for most businesses. In fact, this graphic over here on the left, this was about 38,000 farm estates that we transitioned a few years ago. This little blue slot here is the ones that we needed to have filed returns, but only 0.25% would have paid any taxes. So it is a very, very small portion. About a year and a half ago, the American Families Act, there was a lot of discussion about the loss of stepped-up basis. You remember when that discussion was going around? Because currently, as the law is now, if the basis in your property, when you transfer it to your kids at death, it gets that new basis, whatever it's worth at that point. So I get another nodding heads. Now, there was some discussion about that going away, and oh man, there was lots of discussion about that. However, that was going to, be an effect, but still about 80% of farms, that wasn't going to account because they were smaller farms and there was still a level there that you were going to be able to exempt. Now, this didn't make it out of committee. There was a lot of political discussion about this, but didn't make it out of committee. But on farms with less than $350,000 of gross farm income, this many of them would not have been affected even by that law. So be aware of this and be aware of taxation issues and be aware, work with your attorney or a tax accountant about when to transition assets. But if your estate is exempt from federal taxes, by Kentucky law, it's also exempt from Kentucky estate taxes. And Clint knows a lot more about the law than I do, so direct questions to him or to me and I'll pass them on. But so this, I really think, is not the issue that a lot of folks think it is or it was. So back up to question one. You gotta figure out what you want to transfer. Just transferring the ownership of the assets is relatively straightforward. If you would like your farm or your business or whatever it is to continue, then that is considerably more problematic. And my opportunity or obligation is going to pop up a lot of times here. Discussion, I had this with Patty a little earlier. The titled assets are fairly straightforward. That's the things that you have deeds for, or titled property. You know, that's the tangible stuff that we can touch, and that's, you'll will. Decide how you want it divided up, that's pretty straightforward. I have a colleague out of Family Consumer Science, who she talks about something called non-titled assets. And it's the stuff that doesn't have, you know, clearly a title, but it's the stuff that really causes the problem. Grandma's quilt. That special picture. Mom's banana pudding bowl. My grandmother's churn. I've seen lots more arguments over those sorts of things than I have seen over the land or the bank accounts or anything else. So you may want to see if Nicole's available, bring her in, because she does a really, really good job with that, because that's hard. That is really a hard thing to do, because you get so much emotion involved in it. And so I know, I see you nodding your heads on that one. Intangible assets. For a business, these are things that are important but that you can't really put a dollar value on. How about your reputation in the community? The reputation of your business. You pay your bills. You're an upstanding person. If you have a farm name, or if you're selling livestock, or if you're selling produce or anything else that carries your farm name, that's part of that intangible assets. You can't, it's hard to put a dollar amount on, but it's an important part of the business. I encourage folks that are working multi-generational to start thinking about transferring those things. You know, the sons or daughters or son-in-laws and daughters-in-law, get them involved in helping pay the bills and being out there in the community and taking leadership roles, because those assets are important as well. The two that are really tough are management and leadership. Those are the things that, for better or worse, that I've taught for years. It's an ag management course that I taught earlier today, and we cover the whole gamut. We cover strategic planning, and we cover goal setting, we cover budgeting, we cover finance, we do a little bit of HR, so that's an area I work in. Also, Dr. Will Snell and I are co-directors of the Kentucky Ag Leadership Program. Anybody aware of that program? Been around? I know I don't see any graduates here. It's been around since the middle 80s, and I would encourage you to do this. In fact, we look for representation across the state, and we haven't had a lot of Northern Kentucky folks involved in the Kentucky Ag Leadership Program. So I would solicit and recruit. It's generally designed for, we say, younger farmers, sort of in the 25 to 45 age range. We've had a few older and a few younger. It's a 2-year program, 10 seminars, travel to Frankfurt, travel to DC. We do an international travel experience, and the seminars are focused on developing leadership. Lindy Huffman, the agent down here in Pendleton County, she's been in the last class. So think about that. This fall we will be recruiting for class 14, and we send out information, put it in Farmers Pride and places. So give some thought to that. If you know somebody that you think would be a good candidate for leadership development, that is a very good program. Not because I have anything to do with it, but it's just a really good program. Been around, like I say, since the mid-80s. So management and leadership are the harder things. So the tangible, this is pretty easy. Get the attorney, get the tax accountant, put everything down, divide it up. That's fairly easy. But these non-tangible things, like your reputation, the culture of the business, those sorts of things are much, much harder to transition. I came across this probably in some business magazine or something I was reading a year or so ago. Companies, particularly that are public kind of companies, talk a lot about vision and brand. Well, I think this applies to us almost individually. Brand is how other people see you. Vision is how you see yourself. So if you are known by, If you're selling on a farmer's market or you're selling some product that is known by your brand, that's the brand. But the vision is what you want to do with it. So when I get folks trying to think about how to transition management, I may be jumping ahead of myself here, but this is a good place for this story to happen as well. There needs to be, before the death and transition, this needs to take place while folks are still alive. The story that I think illustrates this well, dividing up responsibilities, financial responsibilities. This is the story. I have a colleague who works a lot more around the country than I do. He was in western Nebraska a few years ago, did a presentation, and after the presentation, an 82-year-old farmer came up to him after the meeting and said, Dr. Colt said, I appreciate what you had to say here, but I have a question for you. He said, well, what is it? This 82-year-old farmer asked him, said, when should I show the boy the books? Yeah. At 82, and the boy hadn't seen the books. You believe that, don't you?
I believe it.
Yes.
A lot of people do that.
Yes, absolutely. It is certainly a believable story because it happens. Now,
Friends won't show their kids the books.
yeah. Now, if you want them to take over the business, it needs to happen. Absolutely. There needs to be some transparency. Because one thing I'm going to talk here in a minute, they need to know whether or not they can make a living doing it.
That's right.
And if you're still alive, support you. That's important too. Dr. Cole said he was back in that western Nebraska town 5 years later. Dad's 87, and the son told him, said, Dad still hasn't shown me the books. Now this was like a 3,000-acre western Nebraska farming operation. A few years after that, the father died. The son still hadn't seen the books. There were 2 siblings. There was no succession plan, and the farm was sold and divided up among the siblings because there was essentially no transition. So yes, show them, let them know the good, the bad, or the ugly. And it's your family, for crying out loud. You show them your lender. So yeah, I think showing them the books is important. One of the ways I think we can do this is give that second generation, next generation, some area of responsibility. You're going to make these decisions. Will they make mistakes? Perhaps. But one of the things about leadership or parenting or anything else is we have to be willing to give folks an opportunity to make a mistake. That's one of the reasons we don't show anything. We're afraid they can't do it. We do it all ourselves. They won't do it right. So we tend to keep it. You've got to be willing. And I've said this to employees. Now I want to be careful. I don't want to make a mistake that's going to destroy the business. But I've got to be willing to say, I'm going to give you some decision authority on this crop or this herd or this property that we've got. And give them the responsibility to do that. I will, in April, I will be speaking to the Nebraska Bankers Association, and they want to know about this topic from the perspective of a lender. What is a lender? What's the lender's role in this? Well, I think one of the things is the lender can insist that I want this financial authority, sort of who signs the notes. We tend, 82-year-old dad signs them until he dies. Well, this is a concrete place where you can bring somebody else into the business. Now, that cuts both ways. I've worked with enough multi-generational farms in Kentucky to know there are some folks in the younger generation that don't want to know. They just as soon spend all their time driving a tractor. And that's not good either. I think that second generation needs to have the desire, and there needs to be the willingness on the older generation to share what's out there. I said management and leadership. This one is probably even more intangible than management, but this is a place that I think that you can engage multiple generations as well. We're notorious, I think, in particularly family farms, for just thinking that everybody knows what we're doing and why, because we've always done it that way. Now, very few entities in corporate America would exist without having some discussions around strategy. You know, where are we headed? Why are we doing what we're doing? I think a lot of family farms, why we're doing it is just because we always have. Well, I'll recommend another video. There's a guy who does some motivational speaking and strategy work in the corporate world named Simon Sinek, S-I-N-E-K, Simon Sinek. Anybody seen or heard of him? Okay. Google this. If you went and Googled Simon Sinek on why, he talks about why the why is important. And I try to get my students to think, I have my students, one of the first assignments in my ag management class is I want them to write a mission statement. Why, you know, a personal mission statement, why they're doing what we're doing. Farms need that as well. And it needs to be understood across generations. It's not just mom and dad's why, it's the family why. And I say that you know, pretty frequently somebody in a family business asks the question, now why are we doing this? That's a legitimate question, there needs to be an answer. Everybody needs to know why we're doing this. I have folks write, and I've had folks say, farmers won't do this, they will if you ask. I used to do some workshops where I'd have folks, multi-day workshops, and I'd have them write down sort of a mission statement and some goals. Adair County, Kentucky, Columbia, Kentucky, 2-day workshop. The assignment at the end of the first day was to go home and write down some goals for your farm. Bring them back in tomorrow. That was one of the requirements of that particular training. The second day, this couple came in. She said to me, she handed me the goals and written down. She said, my husband and I have farmed together for 38 years, and last night's the first time we ever talked about stuff like this. And I thought, whoa. And I suspect they're not alone. Because we just sort of within families, we think that everybody knows that and understands that. But I really, when I'm working on workshops, I like for husbands and wives and families to sit down and write some goals together and write them down. I have a former student who says a goal that's not written down is just a wish. The very act of writing it down does something. And there's some neuroscience that suggests that changes some things in our brain as well. The notion of setting goals. That's part of strategy. The other area, not just the books, is parents are reluctant to give up. If there's any hired employees, they're reluctant to give up that as well. But I think that's a good place that needs to be transferred. If the business is large enough to be using hired labor, get folks engaged with that. And the other thing, many folks that have been in farming or agriculture for a good while have leadership roles on county conservation boards, on extension boards, on local farm bureaus, school boards, all sorts of things. I gave a presentation at American Farm Bureau Young Farmers and Ranchers in Louisville last February, about a year ago. Any of you get Successful Farming magazine? Anybody get Successful Farming magazine? If the February issue is out,
I haven't gotten it yet.
I don't know if I had mine or not. Yeah. This is the February issue of Successful Farming, and it's when your time will come. And it's about this whole notion of leadership in businesses, or particularly at local levels, you know, farm bureaus or extension boards or anything else. Now, I may not survive this article being published because I'm quoted in this article as saying, my question in my presentation was, when is a long time too long? And we have a tendency in rural areas and agriculture for somebody to get into a leadership position and stay in it forever. And there is something to be said, there's a positive thing for longevity and institutional knowledge. But I started this out, and the author talks about a little case study that I've used about somebody who's been county farm bureau president for 46 years, and the reason they're staying in is they want the state record for longevity. That's really the wrong reason. Yeah. But I think all of us, I know it's easy to quit preaching and go to meddling, but I've sat on boards with folks that have just been there too long. And that's hard, because these are folks we live with at the local level. And sometimes we keep electing somebody president of the Cattlemen's Association because he always has been, or she always has been. Now, if they're doing a good job, that's fine. If they're holding the organization together, that's fine. But if they're there just to set a record, or even worse, to get free vacations, that's not a very good reason to do that. So this whole notion of, for lack of a better term, somebody help me come up with a better term, I call it calcification of leadership. It's just sort of where everything gets set up. So that is something in businesses or families that we need to think about transitioning that as well. That, my case study, the guy who's been Farm Bureau president for 46 years has kept at least 2 other people out of a leadership role. Because over that time, they could have done that. It's another presentation. I've given this in several settings, usually out of state where I'm safe. I can get in the car and leave. I did it in Indianapolis back in December. Their Farm Bureau convention, there were about 100, 150 people in the room. And I was going through this stuff about longevity of leadership. And the young people were all back here going, yes. And the old guys were sitting back here all like this. And I was looking for security. So again, and she says this in the article. She asked me when she was quoting me, she said, "Do you mind if I tell how old you are?" No. Because I have to ask the same question. I turned 69 this year. So I've got to know, I want to leave before my department chair says I need to leave. I want to know if I'm still adding value. And I think businesses are no different and families are no different. Yes, as long as there's a need and adding value, that's wonderful. But that's something I think we need to think about. Do you need to stand up stretch? Get a bottle of water. I'm going to go on for. Why don't we do that? Let's take 4 or 5 minutes. I'll field any questions, and you don't have to. But if you want to, there's some water on the end of the table, right, Patty? Yeah, grab a water.
There's extra meals out there. You can take one if you want one.
Or steal the dessert out of one of them. Yeah. Harrison talked about communication. I will not hit that as much, but I have just a few things that probably he doesn't cover, and we cover the way that I would cover it, so we'll do that. But I do want to show you some numbers. Now, these are not your numbers. Your numbers are your numbers. These are the only ones I have. They're the only ones I can get good resources on. But the question is the same. The question over here, if you're going to draw income from the business, will it support a family coming in and the family that's still there? And I see this a lot when I have students that are going to go back to full-time family farms. And the big thing is, they tend to think that we're just going to increase the gross income, but you don't live off of gross income, you live off of net. Now, this is the nerdy numbers part of it. This is what I'll be teaching students in a couple of weeks on farm financial analysis. Any one of these columns would be the pie, the whole pie of the farm business, or any business. The top row is operating expenses, the thing that we spend to grow, the feed, the fertilizer, the fuel, the labor, whatever it is. This is our depreciation expenses that charge off our capital assets. This is the interest that we pay to somebody to owe money to. So those are 3 categories. And then what's left is called the income from operations ratio. In other words, this is what's left to pay our family living, to pay taxes, to service the debt, and to grow the business. Now, these numbers are out of the Kentucky Farm Business Management Program, which is about 400 farms, mostly in south central and western Kentucky, so they tend to be larger farms, and a lot of them are grain farms. There's some dairies, there's some maybe a couple of hog farms, but these tend to be larger commercial farms, but they're all family farms. And of the 400, we have about 150 or so that we can get good family living expense numbers on, and I'll share those in just a moment. But my point is if all of these will add up to $1. There may be some rounding error, but this is so 21%, 4%, 10%, 65%. And I'll teach my students what good numbers are. These, the main thing I want to point out is these are highly variable. This is about 10 years. I'm using the even number of years. but on either end, about 20, 23%. That's pretty darn good. If you're keeping 25 cents of every dollar that you gross, that's a pretty good net farm income ratio. But you notice there's some years in there that it's 6 cents on the dollar, 10 cents on the dollar. Where that makes a difference is if we're thinking about bringing another family back in, and this is some of the students I work with. I said we got about 150 farms or so that we have good family living data on. And this is the last 3 years, 2022 information is not in yet, but family living expenses, taxes, so the red line is about equivalent to an off-farm tax-paying job when you add the taxes back in. And I show this to people say, there's no way you spend $90,000 to $100,000 on average. Yeah, it is. These are good numbers. These were not made up. Are these people living well? I think so. Do they think so? I don't know. There is tremendous variability in that. We have a number of Mennonite farms that are in this program, and they live pretty frugally, but not as frugally as most folks think they do. They spend money as well. They are Walmart. So some of those families spend a good bit of money as well, but there's a lot of variability in this number. I have seen it as high as $2 million. That's in 1 year. If you're spending $2 million on family living, it was big time private tuition and name brand schools and a lot of travel. So, but from that, if that's the family living, let's call it roughly 90,000. This is net farm income for those years, non-farm income, and then the total. And what's left down there is what you're going to grow the business with. I have this graphically. This is 20 years or so. Yeah, about 20 years of family living expenses from that program. And there's a few dips, but it tends to be an upward trend. Years that were pretty tough here. 2009, 10, we declined a little bit, but in general, that line tends to increase over time. Here's where it gets tough on farms, is farm income is so blasted variable. You know, 1 year you're going to do well, and the next year prices are down or there's dry weather, and you don't have 2 pennies to rub together. And this graph suggests that. I mean, there's been some really good years. 2021, really good year. I think 2022 is going to be this, but here's some years that they didn't cover family living expenses on some big commercial farms. So, so that to me is the key of understanding what it's going to cost to keep families going. Now, I like this. Clark Garland was an extension farm manager guy down at the University of Tennessee and a mentor of mine for probably the last 40 or 50 years. He has the concrete theory of family living expenses. Now, I love this. He says that really there's no good estimates. I've just shown you some numbers, but I told you there's a real wide variability. There's no good estimates for what that is. How that relates to concrete is this. Any of you who have ever poured concrete, you probably know how to calculate this. You know, you take the width times the depth times the length in feet. You multiply that together, you divide that by 27, and you got cubic yards, right?
27.
Did I say 7?
27.
Yeah, 27. I meant to say 27. I don't know what I said.
47.
Did I say 40? Oh, at any rate, but you're right. It's 27. Whatever I said. So you divide that by 27. That's a cubic yard. And here's the way concrete works. As they always found out. You calculate that. You call the concrete plant, and you double the order, and you'll just be a little short. Does that ever happen to anybody? Yeah. No, you come up short, right? So family living's like that. If you estimate it, you probably double it, and you're still going to be a little short. The estimates are inaccurate unless you've got good records, just like, you got to have good information to make it work out right. Now, the other thing, business and family living expenses are difficult to separate. Where this relates to concrete is that once you mix that gravel and sand and water and cement and whatever else, once you put it in that, you can't separate it out. You can't take it apart. Family living's kind of the same way. You know, once you roll it all together, it's hard to separate it out. Now this one, the one in the middle, I don't know, you can argue with me, but we've got good data on this. family living expenses are different from rural and urban, just like the further you haul the concrete, the more they're gonna charge you, right? If they're delivering it 35 miles, it's gonna be more than if they're delivering it 5 miles, probably. The comparison to farm and family living is, it costs more to live in the country. And folks tend to think, no, that can't be true. We live off the land. You drive further. I say that a lot of times the difference between a farm family and an urban family is the length of the commute is longer. To take the kids to ball practice or band or whatever it is. Also, and I don't know if this is the case here, I had a comparison because the first year or two we were up here, I lived in Lexington, and then we moved out in Woodford County. My car insurance went up. Now, do you know that if you live in the country, you probably pay more for car insurance? You probably haven't compared because you haven't lived in both places. You haven't asked how much you could save on car insurance or move to town. That's not the thing we ever think to ask. But in general, auto insurance is higher in rural areas. The miles are lower, the accidents may be less frequent, but they're more serious. You know, in town you have fender benders. In the country you run over trees. And so you might ask your insurance agent how much you can save by moving to town, but I don't want to move to town. But there's a number of things like that are more expensive, and we tend to not think about that. But it really is the case, and the sociologists actually have some data to support that. The next Clark's next line is that budgeting, estimating, calculating is hard work. Just like if you've ever poured and finished concrete, I probably wouldn't get an argument that's one of the hardest jobs you can ever do. That's hard work. If you're out there moving that concrete around and floating it and trying to finish, that is hard work. Keeping track of family living is hard work. And then finally, the obvious comparison is that once family living is established, it sets up like concrete. Because Clark, I've heard him use this expression. He says, it's hard to take the barn cat from cream and get it on skim milk. You know, we get used to a standard of living, and it's really, really hard to cut that back, just like the concrete. So, kudos to Clark Garland. So, for just a moment, let's take that $90,000. Yours is going to be different, whatever your desired standard of living is. But now this is another point, Dr. Dave Cole, I attribute this to. We think when we get older, it will be less expensive, but it's probably not. Particularly if you have any health issues or if you do much travel. Then it may cost more when you're 65. All of you would. If you're experiencing health issues like my wife and I, you are very thankful that we have some good medical insurance, because otherwise we couldn't pay for it. It'd bankrupt us all. The other question is there retirement income? Lots of us who have been bivocational are going to have some retirement income. The little farm we have in Woodford County, I'm going to continue to farm it as long as I'm healthy, but about the best I hope for it to do is pay its bills and make a little bit of money. It would never make enough money for me to retire on because it's not big enough. So I've got, my university retirement. Big question is, if you're supporting more than one family, you've got to consider this. Now, here's where I talk to my students. They want to go back to the farm, and they say, okay, we can add, another 500 acres of corn. It used to be 10 acres of tobacco, or we can put 50 more cows in the dairy herd, and that will support us. They tend to calculate the gross income that they would take. It has to be the net. If that net income ratio a minute ago I was showing you is 0.1, you only keep 10 cents out of the dollar, then you need roughly $1 million to get 90,000. Rule of thumb, I tend to tell folks, if you're going to bring somebody back in and support their family living, you need $4 to $6 of gross income for every dollar of net that you need. So I just try to get folks thinking, and these are not, like I say, it's not the exact numbers, it's just to think about the fact that you're going to live off of net, not gross. Now, here's the thing that the folks like me with gray hair are going to like to say this. That ought to be a priority. The retirement income for the parents should be, that's the folks who have been there. They built the business, kept the business going. And I hope young people understand that as well, that, you know, they have an obligation to take care of mom and dad. So, some questions in here, all this I think kind of makes sense. Until about a year and a half ago, I had just about stopped talking about inflation. Now, you know, run it back. I have this graphic. For a number of years, I would say this. This is 1971 to 2021. And this was my observation. There was no one in the room under 40 years of age that had ever seen inflation. And there was no one in the room over 50 that had ever forgotten it. Because if you're over 50, you remember these years. But if you're 40 or under, look here, that's, you know, people under 40 years of age until about a year and a half ago never seen serious inflation. Now they have. So we know what's happened in the last year or so. That has spiked up there. And that's been in the news. And if it wasn't in the news, you'd notice it when you went to the grocery store or the gas pumps or buying anything else. So yes, it's back up there. The 10, 20, 30-year average is running in the 2% range. Now it's jacked up. The numbers came out last week, I guess, with 6.4% on an annual basis. Inflation is actually down some. It peaked in August at 9.1% on an annualized rate. So it's coming down, but still 6.4% is about 3 times higher than most of us were used to. So I'm not telling anybody anything you didn't already know. Here, the point I make in planning for multiple generations is if you're planning on having enough income to support mom and dad into their later years, you know, check and see, is there Social Security, is there some retirement from another job? A big problem I've run into on a lot of farm families is farms, and nobody else for that matter, farmers really didn't want to pay taxes, right? So you expense everything you could. Keep that income as low as possible. That also meant you weren't paying in as much for Social Security. And I've run into more than my share of like farm widows who have said, I'm not drawing hardly anything on Social Security because we never made any money or never declared any money on the farm. So that short run decision sort of came back to bite it. The reason I bring this up is that if you're planning out there, you know, 5 or 10 years, then you've got to take this into consideration. Because even at 2% inflation, in 10 years, that $100 needs to be $122. If you go to 10%, man, you're talking about $250, $260. So there needs to be a ratcheting up of that income stream to do that. Now, here's what we talked about a while ago. One thing for sure, you don't start with that bottom line. However, the next to bottom line is how my wife started a conversation with her mother. It was her mother who died in January of 2020. My father-in-law had died in like 1998. Left my mother-in-law in decent financial shape. She wasn't a wealthy person, but she was in decent financial shape. She, fairly early on, moved into assisted living and spent a good number of years there, which is a way to turn a lot of money into a lot of money. But her mother was the one that, you know, if this topic came up, she would say, oh, don't worry about it, I'll take care of it. Or, even worse, I'll let you kids work it out. Now, is that not a recipe for disaster? My wife's one of 3. Now, fortunately, they've gotten along fairly well. But my wife's mom didn't want to talk about it, so she said, Mom, we've got to start this, we've got to do this. So she sat her down one day and said, okay, let's start at the end. What songs do you want at your funeral? And she told her. And in January of 2020, we did those songs at her funeral. But from starting that conversation, we were able to actually get her to, she lived in Knoxville, and I knew a financial planner down there, and we got her in, and he helped work some things out. But it's a hard conversation to start. There is no doubt that it is a hard conversation to start, but I think the older folks need to do that. It's an awkward topic to start. I mentioned this a minute ago, I think lenders, and that's what I'm gonna tell those bankers in a couple of months, that they can be a catalyst. A lender can tell somebody, well, if I'm going to approve this loan, I need a transition plan for your business. Some folks wouldn't do one any otherwise. A lender can say, okay, you've been signing the notes for all these years. If your son or daughter is going to be taking over the business, bring them into the conversation. So lenders actually, I think, can play a role without being the meddling parents. So I encourage lenders to do that. Now, boy, this is a tough one. Isn't it? And if you came here tonight thinking I would have the answer for you, I don't. I do know that equal is not necessarily fair. I do know that you can think about how to do this. I keep telling folks for the older generations, you know, this sounds kind of callous. It's your stuff. You can divide it any way you want to. And that's true. I mean, and think about it this way, if you want to go way up, you're going to be dead anyway. But now, nobody wants to do that. People want, I think, treat their children well. Now, we can stay here till daylight with horror stories that surround this. You know, kids that have gone off the deep end, or I work with a number of farms that kids have gone off and left the farm, but they still think, you know, if they're 4 kids, that they're each going to get a quarter of the farm. Now, is that fair if one kid stayed on the farm and worked for 30 years? Most folks would say probably not. They'd say no, they've been there. At the risk, I don't know if, because David talked about some other stuff, I know David Marison he and I talked about this notion of if you take the estate and what it was worth when the kids sort of grew up and left, and one kid stayed, then you could realistically think that half of the growth of that business is due to that kid who stayed. That's theirs. I mean, if they hadn't been there, the business probably wouldn't have grown. So half of that growth could go to the sibling who stayed. Then the other part of it maybe could be divided up any way that the parents want to. I've had, you know, if you think that the sibling who stayed on the farm and kept the business going, if they deserve more, then divide it up and like give them 2 shares to 1. Or I don't know. There's not a really good way of doing it. Another way I've seen parents do this, because I've just read some articles in the last day or two about how difficult it is if a remaining sibling has to buy out other siblings. Because that can get real expensive. And they can wind up paying sometimes more than the business is worth. Now, you can value assets differently. I know a number of families that have decided they were going to buy an insurance policy that pays out to the non-farm siblings. There's no cut and dry way of doing this. But equal does not necessarily mean fair. And at the end of the day, you've got to have that discussion. Man, I don't know if I want to go out there or not. I talked to an attorney friend of mine a week or so ago that's working with a pretty big farming family operation out in western Kentucky. 4 brothers. They farmed together for 40 or 50 years. They have at least 3 of the offspring that are in there in the business, and there's other non-farm cousins that are there, and they're trying to put together a transition plan for the business. And this is the reason I'm afraid to go out there. They wanted to do it without talking to wives. Wow. That's not real right. I don't know, I've got this on here somewhere, I don't know if it's on, but no, I'm going to tell them right that you can't do that. Because I know some of the spouses, and they would not be happy with that. So they need to have sort of a discussion and come to some realization that no, we need to get everybody involved, because I think they've got a real serious problem if they don't. This notion of transition team. And most folks say, well, my business or what I own is not real big. I don't know if I need to spend a whole lot of money on it. I don't know. I can't answer that for you. But I do know that you need to get some information and answers to your questions. I have, and known a number of farms and businesses that have done this successfully, put together some sort of a transition team. Because if you think your attorney's gonna do all this for you, the attorney will write the will and divide up the assets. But the other stuff, the attorney may or may not know anything. If there's any tax issues, your tax accountant may be. So you need more than one person answering all these questions. And I don't think any one person's gonna have all the answers. So I encourage folks to put together some sort of a team, and if this is gonna be up to you, however you wanna do this, I just put in some examples here of people who could serve in this. I actually saw a team one time that hired a professional mediator. And in that case, he wasn't needed because they weren't fighting, but I've seen cases where they were. I think have this sort of, if you can get these folks to agree to sit down together, and yes, attorneys and accountants are going to charge you. I mentioned that my dad sold that lakefront property many, many years ago, and he had a real low basis in it, and I had him sit down with an accountant friend of mine to determine how to manage that capital gain he was going to have, because it was going to be pretty substantial anyway. Scads of money. But I set him down with an accountant, he went over the things, and at that time there were some provisions where he could sell the house separately from the land, and it saved him some money. By my rough estimate, it probably saved Dad $15,000 to $17,000 in taxes the year he sold the farm. Well, about, I don't know, a month, 6 weeks, 2 months after we had the meeting, Dad, I was talking on the phone one morning, and he says, you know, that accountant friend of yours sent me a bill. He charged me $200. I said, well, yeah, okay. He said, we wasn't there an hour. He said, ain't nobody worth $200 an hour. I said, Dad, how much money do you think he saved you? Yeah, but ain't nobody worth $200 an hour. Yeah, he was. So those oftentimes are dollars well spent. I still think he thinks he's paid too much. But the other thing, if you do this and you put together a group of people to help you with these decisions, one of these people, or maybe somebody independent, needs to be a facilitator. That word right there. They do this primarily. They listen to what's being said and they write things down. Before the meeting adjourns, that person or somebody says, okay, this is what we've said today. Because if it's not written down, even if these people are giving good advice, and there's a family that the family members leave, and they're going to say, well, I don't think he said that. No, he didn't say we're going to do that. Have somebody write it down. And before you leave, say, this is the points we've agreed on. And that really takes care of a lot of sort of the family squabbles. Because people sometimes are going to hear things different. They're going to hear it the way they wanted to hear it. So I really encourage folks to do that. My last line. I used to think, and I said this for a long time, families need to stop what they're doing, come in, gather around the kitchen table, and hash this out, work this out. I've completely changed my view on that. This is not a kitchen table discussion. There are too many other places for this discussion to take place. Bank boardrooms or extension offices or a school or church or somewhere. Go somewhere off-site. Don't do it at the farm or in the business or particularly in the house. And the reason I don't like the kitchen table is this. Everything that's ever happened in that family is sitting around that table. The good and the bad. All of it's right there. It's present in the walls. It's in the paint. And then here, and I've seen this happen. Just when the discussion got to going really, really good, getting down to the stuff we needed to talk about, and it's getting a little heated, I heard Mom say, that's enough of that. I don't want to hear that. And what happens in discussion? It stops right there. Just when it needed to be going on. So I am a firm believer, don't do this at the kitchen table. Do this somewhere else. One I remember in particular was, it was during the week, and they used a Sunday school room or something at church. Well, they didn't mind, they let them come in there and do that. That probably held the cussing down, too. I don't know. Maybe. Okay, lender's role, I think I've mentioned most of this because lenders can be the person who kind of gets this started. And sometimes, unfortunately, the lender may know more about the business than the people do. Because the lender's really the one who's wanted the balance sheets and the income statements, and they've got sort of a track record. So on that, and that's one we sometimes don't think about including. You would mostly agree, yeah, I'd like to have an accountant or an attorney in there, maybe a financial planner. But a lot of times we don't think the lender, because some of us don't want the lender knowing everything. But hopefully if you've had a good relationship with a banker or a lender, and they want to keep the business, if that $100 coming in, that lender wants to keep that business, then they are a good person to have at the table. So give that some thought, because I think most folks don't, not right off the top of the head, they don't think that's, the lender ought to be there. And then I know sometimes there are multiple lenders and there's all kinds of issues, but, okay, I've said this multiple times, title of assets easy, the professionals can handle that. Management and leadership is hard to train. And then my thing about the West Kentucky farm family, I'm going to take this slide to them. Do not exclude the spouses. And here's what I'm going to tell them. I'm going to say, okay, you guys sit here as brothers and nephews and all, and you sit here with this group and you hash this out and you get this thing together, and then you all leave and go home. What's the first thing your wife's going to ask? Right? That's going to be the very first topic of conversation. And are they going to say, well, I can't tell you? I don't think so. So I don't know when I'm going to go out there, but I'm going to be loaded for bear. And it's a family I've known for years. I've had 3 of the family members as former students, and I think I can talk frankly to them and let them know that, no, you're making a mistake if you're trying to leave the spouses out of this discussion. Because they've been there every day all along. And they're going to know as soon as you get home. So, again, it's an opportunity, not an obligation. Show the boy the books. All of these I think I've talked about. I've had that long time too long. I'd really like for folks to sort of build some sort of a timeline. Now, we do not know when death will happen. We don't know. So you can't put this timeline down and say, yeah, I'm going to die in December of 2025 because the tax law is going to change in 2026. But if you have some sort of a timeline as to when people are going to start taking over certain responsibilities, then I think that gives some benchmarks and some titles and some things to work for. Now, here's another one, and this, as morbid as this sounds, I have seen this work very well with families or businesses where there were a number of people involved. I have suggested that they sit down around the table, when they're having these discussions, sit down around the table, write everybody's name on a piece of paper, and put it in a hat in the middle. Pull one name out of the hat. That person just died. It's called a drop dead test. Now, that's a little uncomfortable. But corporations work this way because they know they have contingency plans and they have like key personnel insurance kind of things. So you pull that name out of the hat and that person's dead. Now the discussion still goes on. What are we going to do now if that person dies? And usually there's some discussion going on. Now here's where it gets interesting. I've never seen it fail. That person wants to talk. And if I'm there, I said, you can't talk, you're dead. Now, I know this sounds kind of morbid and creepy to do this. But men, I had one of the most rewarding calls I think I've had in my career was probably 2 years ago. I got a call from a Western Kentucky farmer that I've known, had his son in class, known him for years, and he called me up just out of the blue, and he said, I would like to thank you for having us do that drop dead test because we very nearly tried it. At that time, we tried it for real. At that time, I was not aware. He'd spent 6 weeks in the hospital and was totally out of communication. It was something real serious, and the farm had to go on without him. Now, fortunately, he recovered. I saw him at the Ag Expo in Owensboro about 3 weeks ago, and he brought that up again. He said, that's one of the best things that we did, was to think about what we would do if I died. And that puts that conversation out there on the table. If this is done right, there aren't any surprises. You know, everybody knows before the events happen what's going to happen. Another family I've worked with, this is one of those cases where there's 3 siblings. One of the sons stayed on the farm. They have a very successful farming operation. They've grown the farm. They've done very, very well. 2 siblings, one of them is a physician in Nashville, and the daughter, is actually an actress in Los Angeles. So they really have some strange things going on. 2 siblings that really have, decent incomes, but the farm is there. There are grandparents involved, and they have been sort of poster children for doing it right. They've been thinking about this for a long, long time, because back in the 70s, they learned a hard lesson. Back when those tax rates were high and exemptions were low, they had to sell a bunch of property to pay the taxes when one of the grandparents had died. So they decided, we're not going to do that again. They built a plan. Now here's the interesting thing that they do. Because this whole thing I'm talking about is not just a one and done. This is not Kentucky basketball. You do this, but every year you need to look at it and say, is this still valid? You don't just stop. And people tend to want to think, okay, I want to get my accountants and lawyers, I'm going to do this and never have to touch it again. Well, you need to look back at it, particularly when things change. When another family member or somebody dies or moves or divorces. I don't know if I have this one on here. I've got the 5 Ds here somewhere. It will show up. When things change, you need to go back and revisit that. Yeah, I got the one and done thing there. This is another one I've asked folks to try. Go on vacation, don't take the cell phone. I don't know, do you get cell phone coverage on a cruise? Anybody been on a cruise? I never have. They have cell phone coverage out in the middle of the ocean. If they don't, that'd be a good place to do it. Go.
I don't think so. I don't think they have.
They don't have, if it did, it'd have to be satellite or something with it.
They do, but it's expensive.
Oh, okay, so it is the satellite thing.
Mom
So,
and Dad never tracked on.
do I?
Mom and Dad never tracked on.
Well, so they take my advice seriously, right? Yeah, no, that's good, because these blasted things, and we've become so dependent upon these that we're never out of touch. We're on the phone all the time. We take our leadership classes overseas, and we were in Spain and Morocco in December, and some of them were on the phone half the time, back essentially trying to run their business from somewhere else. So practice it, try it out. What do we got here? Why they fail. I talked about earlier that family living. Mixing family and business, and there is no way not to. Because that's what we are. We are family businesses. So we might as well not even think that we can do this, but having a family business causes problems. Back to an opportunity or obligation. Kids who don't want to do this shouldn't feel an obligation to do it. They should have permission to try something else. And that's something that's hard for us to do in that. Here's my 5 Ds. These are the things that can really, really hit. I know Nicole talks about these. Death, disability, disaster, divorce, and disagreement. Those are events that can really foul this up in a big way. Whoop, wrong button. But at the heart of this is this failure to communicate. And this is where I'm glad you had David Marison in. And I'm sure David gave you lots of illustrations and examples. He told you, I'm sure, you may not have the video, but I'm sure he told you his family had serious problems. I've heard him tell those stories several times before. So he knows of what he speaks, and he does a very good job with it. So failure to communicate is the big one. Sometimes it's parents just making assumptions and not giving kids affirmation when they need it, not understanding this. Am I being redundant with opportunity or obligation? I hope so. This is a big one. You know, sibling disputes, we've all seen that one, but all of these are a failure to communicate. Now, David, I'm just gonna throw a few things in here that he may or may not have had. But my big one was don't worry, I'll take care of you. All these other things clearly can cause that. That transition team, a facilitated transition team, can help with this. Nonverbal language. It is a big deal. Now, depending on which communication experts you want to talk to, somewhere probably 2/3 to 3/4, maybe more of the communication we have is nonverbal. In families, it's probably higher than that. Because these are people we've been with all the time. We read their signals whether we know it or not. My sister married into a family that I'm not sure they spoke. I mean, they just were a quiet group of people. We'd be at a meal, and the potatoes would get passed, and I didn't even know anybody had asked for them. I mean, they were experts at this. They were really good. So, my picture here, again, this is my son. Are those two young people communicating? Darn tootin' they are. And at that time, neither one of them had very many words. But they were, so nonverbal communication is a big, big deal. This 400, 125, we can hear 400 words a minute. You know, those guys who talk real fast on the commercials, most of the time we can figure out what they're saying. We hear faster than we talk. That's a problem. Because if we're hearing faster than we're talking, we're trying to figure out what we're saying while they're still talking. So we really need to be thinking about listening. Communication is not just about talking or writing or saying things. I'm convinced a big bunch of it is listening. We need to focus. Empathy doesn't mean feeling sorry for somebody. That's sympathy. Listening empathically is listening to get the other person to talk. And usually when we're listening, we're trying to figure out what we're going to say. So, you know, there's some things that we can do here. This, okay, what are you saying? I would like to tell me more. That's a non-threatening way of keeping a conversation going. You're not putting anybody on the spot. You're just making a genuine inquiry. Somebody says something. You say, well, tell me more. And I think that's a good way. I want to hit this 2793 real quick, and we'll begin to wrap things up here. There's been this issue around for a long, long time, especially back in the 80s. When COVID came along, all of us were stressed. That was a stressful time for all of us, personally, professionally. It was just tough. And as a result of that, we were asked to put some things together on dealing with stress. We brought some experts in that could help with the mental health side. There was a lady, she's retired now, but she was sort of known as UK's ag nurse. She was super good at what she did. She grew up on South Woodford County Farm, so she knew farming, and she had taken, I worked with her 25 or 30 years ago on some farm health and safety stuff, because we have a hazardous occupation. She is super, super good, a good friend. So we brought her in. We brought some other folks in to talk about managing and dealing with stress. And I had come across a communications expert. At the time he was out of Columbia University. He has his own business now called, his name's Vince Cavello. And he has several things about communication under stress. And he works with professionals and politicians and all folks about how they need to communicate under high stress situations. But he has this thing about 2793. And I've never heard this before. I don't know if he came up with it. It's really good. In high stress communications, we need to keep our responses to 27 words, 9 seconds, and no more than 3 thoughts. Now, that doesn't make a lot of sense until you sort of see some examples. Okay, let's talk about your line of credit. This is a limit. Current market conditions kept you from making timely payments, so let's take a look at your options going forward. You can count them, that's 27 words. It took me about 9 seconds to say that. I have time to do it in the past. And there's 3 thoughts on it. Now, I use this one, especially with lenders, because they tend to want to talk in terms of financial ratios and all sort of kind of stuff that really stress people out. But in a stressful situation, that's really pretty much all they need to say initially. The other one, again, we had a lot of this happen in 2019. A lot of folks in Kentucky looked at hemp. So again, a lender might say, well, hemp looked like a good idea in 2019. A barn full of unsold inventory is sure hurt your cash flow. Let's explore options going forward. Again, short, to the point, and you've not had to read somebody a treatise. This one is, a little extension agents love this one. Yep, there's something wrong with that plant. Let's get it sent off to the diagnostic lab and see if they can tell if it's chemical damage or a disease. Farmer comes in, and I've seen this, every county agent has experienced this. Somebody brings something in, they're convinced that the neighbor's spray drift or the power company or somebody has destroyed their crop, and they're mad. They're stressed. And really, the agent can diffuse that, to something like this. And we've all experienced this one at the bottom. You go to the funeral home and you don't know what to say. You don't need to say a lot. That's a stressful situation. It's stressful to folks who've lost somebody. It's stressful. We've all been there. You go up and somebody you know well, and you want to say the right thing, and sometimes you don't say hardly anything. And this is one of those 27 words, 9 seconds, 3 thoughts. And if, you don't have to count the words. I did because I wanted these illustrations to be appropriate, in case somebody was sitting back there counting my words. So it doesn't have, it can be 20 or 30, but you get the idea. In high stress situations, we don't need to go on and on and on and on. It doesn't help. So this is one, probably David didn't mention this one, right? No. Okay. I need to talk with him because I think he would be really interested in using this kind of stuff. But I had it in his presentation, so I didn't remember, I hadn't seen David before, I didn't think he had that in there. So again, you don't have to count, but just think about responses in high stress situations being short and to the point. And that really, really helps. Stephen Covey, who wrote 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, said you have to first understand, then be understood. And I like that. I like Covey's work. Okay, so major challenges determine whether the business can afford it. I went through some of those obligatory economist numbers. Bigger challenge is probably figuring out how the family wants to handle it. And the biggest challenge is to create and then execute that transition plan. Because if you spend money on attorneys or accountants or anybody else, and you get this plan and you throw it up on the shelf and never look at it, and it goes 15 years before somebody dies and you need it, it's probably not going to be right. So think about developing that plan, revisit it, and have it in place when you need it. Because everyone's going to have this. I mean, even if there's not a transition plan. So I like to think this, it's not a will, it's a way of doing things. So, folks, I can talk to daylight. But I suspect you don't want me to. I may have worn you out with words already. Today I did a little thing with the students, and I said, did I strain your brains? And they said, yeah! So I hope I haven't strained your brains. But is this useful? Is this helpful? Very much. Okay. The kind of things that you can think of, if you pull some things out of this and go home and consider this as you're doing, one of the hardest things I ever did. Man, raising crops and livestock, that's easy. This is the hard one. So I hope I've been of some value to you. Let me know if I can help again in any way. So, okay.
Thank you.
And I'll